As a maritime archaeologist specializing in ancient Asian ship construction and maritime trade, Dr. Flecker has been a senior visiting fellow at the IC's Yusof Ishak Institute repeatedly since 2015. He has been directing shipwreck excavation in Singapore waters on behalf of the National Heritage Board since 2016. Today, he will be sharing with us the work he did for the wreck of the Nuestra Señora de la Concepcion, a Manila galleon. There will be a Q&A after his talk, so do save your questions for that segment. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Flecker to start his talk.
Okay, thanks very much for the introduction. It's great to see this turnout, and I thought a lot of people would be out Halloweening tonight, so there are some. We have a front row of pirates, and the golden age of piracy didn't actually start till a decade or so after the Concepcion went down, but good try, good try. Anyway, once upon a time, a young, just graduated civil engineer decided that he'd go sailing for a year before starting work. So he jumped on the first yacht sailing out of Fremantle, Perth, and went where it went, which was Bali. Then he flew into Singapore. He met a very fascinating American man by the name of Bill Mathers, who had a wonderful 25-meter-long schooner, and then spent the next 2 months or so sailing up the east coast of Thailand and Malaysia, diving on isolated reefs, sailing around, and occasionally finding a few bits of broken porcelain. Shortly after that, this is 1984, so in 85, the said young fellow joined Bill Mathers' marine construction company in Singapore. And shortly after that, Bill decided he was going to sell his 1/3 share of the company and follow a lifelong dream. His dream, he was a Yale history major. His dream was to find the Manila galleon, the first one that had ever been found. So he put a large chunk of the proceeds of that sale into research, and he had two guys, Peter Hebb, David Earle, going to pretty well all the Spanish archives all over the world, hunting for a Manila galleon. And he came to me just before he left, and he said, when I find my Manila galleon, he was full of confidence, I'd like you to come along and be my diving supervisor. And I said, well, my qualification is a cancelled C-class sport diving license from Australia. And he said, here's the US Navy diving manual, big volume like that. He said, read that and don't tell anyone you're not qualified. So that's what happened. So I carried on engineering for the next 2 years or so, and he carried on with his researches very diligently. And they came up with 40 Manila galleons that had been lost. And then they narrowed it down to 2 which were lost in the Northern Mariana Islands. And one of them was the Santa Margarita, lost in 1601. She was lost on the island of Rota. But the circumstances were not wonderful in terms of salvage prospects or excavation prospects. She was anchored along the shore, and the local islanders, the Chamorros, one night, on a stormy night, they went out and cut the anchor line. So the ship was deliberately beached and wrecked on the reef and plundered by the locals. So there wasn't likely to be a great deal left. We did actually find that wreck, and Bill was correct in assuming there wouldn't be a great deal left. They found one other one, the Nuestra Señora de la Concepcion, wrecked in 1638. And that had a very different circumstance to the loss, much more probability of something showing up. So the guys looked into it in great detail, and there was a great deal of information on it, except there are 30 or so survivors, and a lot of the information seemed to have been buried. But later on, they found a second report from a group that had gone in. The Spanish had gone back 45 years after the wreck and had salvaged the bronze cannons and immediately put them back into service, just scraped the coral off and put them back into service. And then they wrote a report and saying the cannons were lying in 9 brasas of water, a musket ball, a musket shot from shore. So the information on the location and the bay that it was lost in came from that secondary salvage. But in the meantime, they determined all the circumstances of the vessel and some of the crew and the general of the galleons. So the governor, the Spanish governor of the Philippines, Sebastián Hurtado de Corcuera, appointed his 22-year-old nephew, Juan Francisco. That was a recipe for disaster, obviously. Had no experience, had never gone sailing, had just been a crew coming over to Philippines. So there were two ships, the Concepcion and the San Ambrosio. San Ambrosio was quite a bit smaller. Concepcion was considered to be the largest vessel of her kind at that time. And I'll just briefly look at this image. This is done by a guy, Roger Morris. He did it for National Geographic and obviously did a lot of research to do this painting. The only thing that's probably wrong is he's got the vessel alongside a dock. And when you don't have a bow thruster and you don't have tugs, getting a big sailing ship alongside a dock is virtually impossible. They all anchored off, just like they did in Singapore roads, and bumboats, or the equivalent, came out to load the cargo. But importantly, you have a Chinese junk here. So it's the Chinese junks that brought virtually all the cargo that was loaded onto the Manila galleons to go back to Mexico and then to carry on to Spain. And some of these vessels had 60 to 80% of the cargo was silk. So it was raw silk, it was woven silk in many different shapes and sizes and colors. They also brought ceramics in the 17th century, not huge quantities. 18th century, there was quite a lot more. And in the background, there's a dhow. It could be an Arab dhow or it could be an Indian dhow. The construction was very similar. So it wasn't only silk they loaded, they also had cotton. And it was cotton for clothing, but it was also canvas, really coarse material for sails. And that came from India. They had pepper, came from the Malabar coast, and they had gemstones, a lot of them coming from Sri Lanka, and also cinnamon coming from Sri Lanka. So these are the sort of vessels, far less in those, but junks, they sometimes had up to 40 junks coming in just to provide the cargo for the Manila galleon. Well, unfortunately, there's no manifest made in 1638, and there's probably a good reason for that. If you don't have a manifest and everything is declared as private trade of the governor, by the way, you don't have to pay tax. So we don't know what was put on board. We know that the previous trip, the Concepcion had done one voyage to and fro 2 years earlier, and it carried 1,200 chests. It also carried about 2,000 stoneware storage jars. A lot of those would have been for water and food. So a massive cargo, but we had no real idea. I'm sure a lot of it was similar to the standard cargoes coming across, but probably a few more items of personal possessions of the governor. So the voyage, you probably realize this is often stated it's the longest trade network in the world. It went from 1565 to 1815, 250 years. But there were long gaps, especially at the start. So the route coming, we've gone too far, the route coming from Acapulco took full advantage of the southeast trade winds and a current that went with those trade winds. So the voyage was relatively fast, a couple of months, going pretty well along the equator into San Bernardino Strait and then up to Manila. The voyage coming back was a very, very different story, and it took a long time to actually find it. So down here, this is the southwest and the southeast monsoon in Singapore at the time that the vessels left, and that might extend a little bit to the east of the Philippines, but then you run into the trades and you're not going to go anywhere, you'll go backwards. So they found this route going right up to the north. It went past Japan. In fact, some Manila galleons were lost in Japan. And then over the north, and then down the coast of California, and into Acapulco. They weren't allowed to stop anywhere along here. They had to come in here so that the Spanish tax representative could take his big share. And then a lot of the cargo would make its way by mule train across to Veracruz and then go by a Spanish galleon back to Spain. So it's a major, major voyage. So our vessel of concern here, the Concepcion, she went to the east, but instead of turning north, as she was supposed to, she must have had a very favourable westerly wind. She actually got across here quite quickly. And she struck on the island of Saipan on the 20th September 1638. So that's Saipan. This is the Mariana Trench here, and that's the island. And this is a Gingan Bay, and that's where the researchers identified where the vessel had gone down. By the way, this is Tinian Island, and that little airstrip there is where the Enola Gay took off and bombed Hiroshima. And there is another painting also by Roger Morris. I think it's really lifelike. I think this is exactly what a wrecking scenario would be onto a shallow fringing coral reef. And of course, with our Juan Francisco, 22-year-old in command, when the vessels came across, they were going together as they were supposed to, but there wasn't a strict rule on staying together on the voyage back because it was so long, sometimes 6 months, very tempestuous. On the voyage over from the east to the west, yes, they were supposed to stay together all the time. But the San Ambrosio, she turned up to the north as she was supposed to, and some people on the crew wanted to follow, as they should, and others said, no, this is a wonderful breeze from the west, let's keep taking advantage of it. So there was a big split between the crew. There was a mutiny. The governor or the captain of the fleet could do nothing about it, had no way of managing the men. And while they were fighting between themselves, there was a squall came up, all the sails backwinded, and dismasted the vessel. So she wasn't actually driven onto the shore by a storm. I mean, there might have been a small storm, but it wasn't a typhoon or anything. She was disabled. They couldn't control the vessel. So she struck on the reef. There would have been hundreds of people, sometimes 400 people on board a galleon. There's some speculation there were a bit less this round, but there was only 30 or so that survived. And these are the Chamorros having a wonderful time, doing some cleaning up of the beach. They also cleaned up a lot of the Spaniards. Many Spaniards had stopped on the way to the Philippines and hadn't treated them particularly well. And they took that out on the survivors, or short-lived survivors, on the Concepcion. So this is Agingen Bay. Now, Bill's an infinitely confident man. He got on a plane when he had all the research information. He went into Saipan. He walked along the bay, and he picked up blue and white porcelain shards off the beach. And he said, that's it. Voila, I've found my wreck. He never even got his feet wet, never went for a dive. Flew back to London. He had friends in Christie's. He showed them all the shards and said, what's the age of these shards? They said, yeah, that's very late Ming. End of Ming was 1644. The wreck went down in 1638. So he was completely convinced that he had found his wreck just by walking along the beach. So he went back to Singapore, where his marine construction company was. They had access to the old Promet shipyard out in Geelong, just near Pandan Creek. And he mobilized the vessel. This is actually an oil rig support vessel. It does the painting and maintenance work on oil rigs. So he mobilized this vessel, and we went full on. He put on a diving bell. That's a pretty antique diving bell, by the way. And a decompression chamber, fitted out with all sorts of compressors and diving gear, excavation gear, and a crew of 30 people, including the Thai crew themselves, a bunch of riggers from Borneo, the Ibans. We had photographers, film crew, author, conservators, divers, you name it. They were all on as if he'd actually found his wreck, very confident. And then we went back to Saipan and anchored up right in the middle of the bay. And I was one of the first ones to come in. We went out there, and I jumped on board and saw these wonderful ropes hanging over the side, said, oh, that's fantastic. Pretended to be Tarzan, jumped off the side of the boat, landed in the water on the side of my head and broke my eardrum. So as a diving supervisor, I wasn't allowed to go in the water for 3 weeks. But they helped me out by, that's after 3 weeks. We've got the AH3 helmets there, which are airflow through the helmet. There's no water inside, so if my eardrum went again, then the water wouldn't go and flood my brain. But in the meantime, they worked for 3 weeks, and all they found, initially they found nothing. And everyone was happy to go back on the beach and find more blue and white shards. And then they started to find ballast stones. Ballast stones were right on the western edge of the bay. And then they found some cannonballs. So they were getting pretty excited about that, but after 2 days you don't get really excited about cannonballs. And all that time I'm thinking, oh, thank heavens they're not finding anything. And then I managed to get back in the water. And before I say what we did find, I'll just point out how much forethought Bill had. So this is a camera. This does the same sort of a job, probably less resolution than if you put your iPhone into a little housing right now. But this is in 1987. And it was a digital camera hardwired to the surface with a guy sitting in a cabin up there watching in real time what was going on the seabed in pretty high resolution. When another guy had this acoustic beacon, behind the cameraman there's a tripod, so we had 4 of those tripods, and that was an acoustic positioning system, so it would give a position within a few centimetres on the seabed. So for that time, this is far more advanced than any institution was using to salvage a shipwreck, and this is a commercial operation. It was under contract to the government of the Northern Marianas. Not only that, but he contracted a company in Singapore, of course, to develop a very early digital processing system. So this is a digital camera here. It's all stored on the computer, an ancient computer. So every artifact we could bring up and make digital images, have a wonderful database. But he was so advanced that when we finished the project and had this wonderful system and all the data we'd saved, we dismantled it, took it off the boat, and I don't think it was ever put back together again on the shore. And of course, nobody else had the technology to read our little disk. So all that information was never actually utilized as a functioning database. He did go ahead and publish a 550-page archaeological report. So it's all in that, that's online. But unfortunately, we can't just go and scroll through all these wonderful color images on a database. We also had on board a pretty well-equipped conservation lab that's down in the hold of the vessel. So there was real-time conservation going on as well. Very advanced for that time. This is a painting that was done by one of our divers. And the visibility is exaggerated, but not by a great deal. The visibility in Saipan is really amazing. Pretty risky. We had our ship here. These are 2 steel wires going back to anchors. And the mornings, sort of before breakfast, I'd go down and we'd move our wire from coral head to coral head as we moved along the reef and excavated. This is called a water dredge or an eductor. On a manifold here, it's driven by the ship's fire monitor, so it's really powerful. If you get your finger across in front of that and a rock hits it, you have broken fingers immediately. But we needed it because we're digging through all of these fringing gullies. There are sometimes 4 meters of rubble and sand in that, and we had to get to the bottom of all those. Often there were boulders over the gullies we wanted to get to, so we'd use 500-kilogram lift bags and lift that off the boulders. We had a lot of metal detectors, which were absolutely useless. I'll tell you why in a second. And we had this big anchor down here, which we didn't actually need the metal detectors to find. But that's quite a realistic view of what we were doing on a day-to-day basis. We were essentially archaeologically mining the whole shoreline, a kilometre of fringing reef. And that's the nice aerial view, and that's where she struck out here. That's where we begin to see the ballast stones. And then they carry on, and the cannonballs show up here, and then over here you start to find a bit of porcelain. Just by way of interest, this was one of the hardest fought battles in World War II. It was the amphibious assault on Ngee Bay by the Americans. And they came in unaware that there were 2 Japanese machine gun emplacements on those 2 points. Crossfire there, and they got completely wiped out on the first wave that came through. So the whole seabed here is covered in bullets, shrapnel. We had unexploded mortar shells, and out here there's a deep drop-off. We had a 16-inch shell which had gone down and buried the nose into the coral reef, unexploded. And we were dropping anchors out there, so that was a little dodgy. We only found out about that later. But paradoxically, now we come forward, the Japanese emplacement's a huge American attack. It's an American protectorate now. And this is a golf course, which was 99% utilized by Japanese tourists coming in the weekend. And we're salvaging a Spanish galleon here, so that's a little bit of a history mix-up. So this is our plot that we did of the reef. That's where it struck. Ballast stones, cannonballs, porcelain, anchor, and then we start to find pieces of stoneware. Broken small pieces, and then they get bigger pieces, and finally out here, we're getting out towards 45 meters, we start to find intact storage jars. And before I go fully onto the storage jars, I'll just dismiss the blue and white porcelain. Again, showing how optimistic Bill is. He knew that all the galleons beforehand had been carrying blue and white porcelain from China, from Concepcion. fantastic stuff, especially the very end of the Ming. It's cruk, porcelain. But we kept on looking, very little at the bottom of the fringing reef. Most of it was up on the top of the reef and on the beach. And at the end of the day, the stuff he had found, that was about the biggest stuff we found. 350 years of typhoons had completely obliterated the cargo. And he had loaded a container with this wonderful 2-part foam stuff, so we were going to fill up the container with intact blue and white porcelain. So that didn't quite happen. These pieces I've illustrated here, what the shards used to be, came from the Hatcher junk, which sunk around 5-6 years after the Concepcion. So it would have been very similar to that. The Hatcher junk and other ships of that era had a lot of closed shapes, vases, jars. This one, pretty well everything were either dishes or bowls or cups. There were no closed shapes, apart from one, and that was found out at 45 metres. That's the top half of a jar with the monster head handles, which originally would have looked like that. So that's a piece we found in a collection as a comparison. And that was the biggest piece of blue and white we found. The anchor was quite evident on the seabed. It's relatively small, actually. The vessel itself, said to be 2,000 tonne. By the way, that's not to be compared with the Shah Mancher, which I've talked about recently. That was 1,000 tonne. But it was 1,000 tonne in late 18th century measure, which is actually a measure of volume. The Shah Mancher carried 1,400 tonnes in its final cargo, excluding the ballast stones. The 2,000 tonnes, or in this case toneladas, which are very close to tonnes, would have been a displacement. So it's the whole weight of the vessel, the ballast, the cargo, the sails, everything, anchors, cannons. 36 cannons, probably on the Concepcion. So a very different measure, they can't be compared. But the length would have been similar, about 145 feet was about the length of the Concepcion, 50 feet wide. Very similar in dimension to the Shah Mancher. And that anchor is about a 4-metre anchor, so it would have had bigger anchors than that. They were probably salvaged at the same time as the cannons. And there are the storage jars. So we followed that trail of stoneware out across the bay. And the things got bigger and bigger, and it sort of turned out that it was completely separate to the wrecking of the vessel along the reef. The ship was dragged along the reef by the winds and the current, and the jars were probably on deck. There were 1,900 jars on board the vessel. Some of them with cargo, a lot of them were actually lashed on deck, lashed to the rigging with water or food for the crew and the passengers. And later on we found some with lids. They had teak lids, which were sealed in place. I'll show you some in a minute. Sealed in place with wax or with resin. And if there was an air gap, then they would have been semi-buoyant. They would have still been on the seabed, but they would have rolled along the seabed quite nicely. And there was an eddy current in the bay. So an eddy current had come out with like a rip tide and pulled all these jars out into deeper water. So this is actually getting down towards 70 metres. So there was an old coastal reef, a submerged reef from eons ago, like a mirror image of the fringing reef where the wreck went down. And there were big gullies in that, and a lot of these jars had actually gone down the gullies and they'd concreted into the coral at the bottom. So we had a wonderful time diving in up to 75 metres on air with twin tanks, which I don't think anyone does anymore. It's all trimix or mixed gas to go to that sort of depth. And we had these primitive old buoyancy vests. We actually used some of our breathing air to inflate the lift bag. So pretty suicidal in hindsight, but we managed to do that for months at a time. The water is crystal clear. We did it almost in a state of meditation. We'd never fight the current. You'd drift down from the dinghy, would drop you off on the surface. You'd drift down, you could see the jars. 75 metres, you could see them down. And you'd look up and you could see the boat on the surface. So it was beautiful conditions. And you'd drift over, you'd find a jar, you'd send it to the surface. We'd had 15 minutes on the bottom. And then we'd have a little buoy on a reel. The boat would follow that buoy. And we'd go up and do a bit of decompression at about 30 feet, 10 metres under the boat. And he would slowly take us in. We'd go up to the next step. And by the time we're up to 3 metres, we're in at the coral reef. And we'd finish off our hour-long decompression finding other interesting cargo. So it was a very nice way to do it. And there, sorry, these two guys getting in the way of the storage jars. But this is out at Geelong, in a warehouse in Geelong. 156 intact storage jars we managed to salvage from the seabed. They've been largely cleaned with acid to get the coral off, although quite a few we left it on. Those are the wooden lids. They're made of teak, so they would have sealed. This is one example. This is actually a wine jar with a Chinese stamp there. It's the word money on the wine jar. I don't know why that's on the wine jar. But of these 156, almost all of them are missing all the lug handles. They've all got 4 lug handles. And I'm guessing that they were tied to the rigging or to the other fittings on the deck by those lug handles. In the violent wrecking of the vessel, all the handles broke off and those jars went over the side. Otherwise, it's pretty hard to explain why they're all missing. And if you look carefully, you can see there's stamp marks in a few, but there's also chipped in marks. A bit hard to see on that one. So we had our Filipino artist, wonderful Eduardo. He was extremely talented, and he took these little rubbings of all the marks on these storage jars. They actually turned out to be the same sort of marks that you get on the silver ingots that the Spaniards got from South America and sent back to Spain or to the Philippines. So here some of them are on the jars, and they're co-joined initials, which might be the owner of the cargo within that jar. Sometimes they're symbols like a crown or an anchor. Some of it's old script, it's Tagalog in an old Filipino script, and some were Chinese characters. This is also the Filipino script as well. And some were actually symbols of elements or potential cargo within the jar. We found 2 jars with cargo still in. It was a Styrex benzoin, which is an aromatic resin from Sumatra. And it was used as an aromatic and as a medicine. We got so excited about that big pile of storage jars at the bottom, we actually thought, following all the great treasure hunters in the Florida Keys, we thought, mother lode, it's got to be the mother lode. But 75 was pushing it, so we wanted to look a bit further. We went and hired this mini submarine from Rota. It was a tourist submarine. We hired that. We tried this diving bell, and we lowered it down. It's got no propulsion, no position control. We lowered it down on a crane from our vessel, a live vessel moving along the reef. And we managed to smash it into the side of the reef with 2 people inside. So we thought, maybe not a good idea. So we got hold of that submarine and had a fantastic time. We dived down to about 250 meters further off the reef, and we found absolutely nothing from the wreck. But to go diving in Gorgonian corals, which were as big as trees, we actually drove the submarine looking up at the Gorgonian corals in still ambient light. A little bit, down at 200 meters or so. So it was very spectacular, big waste of money though. But we persevered in on the reef. So this is the bedrock. You have to get through quite a lot of sand and coral rubble to get to the bedrock. This is a big crack, sometimes there's very small cracks. We improvised with all sorts of gear. This is an airlift. This is a really big water dredge run off the fire monitor. And this is not a worm. So after lots and lots of persevering, we found musket balls and all sorts of little bits of metal. We found some gold chain. And we had no idea there was going to be gold on this wreck. It wasn't on the manifest. We weren't aware of any other gold cargoes, certainly not gold jewellery, on Manila galleons before this time. And that's what it looked like when it came up on deck. So we had a fines table on the deck of the vessel. Every time a diver would come up, he'd use his cotton glove. We'd put these gold buttons. That's a gold button right here, down the back of the glove, and they'd all come up and everyone would swarm around the fine table and see what exciting things had been found on the bottom. That's a ruby ring, cabochon cut ruby, and these are filigree chains. So not a bad consolation prize, considering we were going there for the blue and white porcelain. That shows a bit of an idea of the numbers. We actually got several hundred of this particular type of bead, and there were many different types of bead. And this is after they've been cleaned up. We just use a little ultrasound bath with some cleaning solution, and they came up very nicely. Gold does not rust. It does get abraded, and this is 22.5 karat gold, so it's very soft. So it does get abraded by the sand and the coral, and a lot of them were crushed by the coral again. So when we brought this collection back to Singapore, we actually had 6 antique jewellery experts come down from Hong Kong. And they worked with us down near Alexandra Road for 6 months, uncrushing and doing some minor repairs of the gold jewellery. And when we did a repair, we used about a 16-carat gold, so it's very clear what's a repair and what's the original. This is an illustration. This is Queen Elizabeth I, and she dressed just like her cousins over in Spain. There's a reason she's pictured seated, because there's no way she could stand up with the weight of all that gold on her dress. So these are little gold buttons, just like the ones we were finding on the wreck. Plus these big, there's rubies here and diamonds, table-cut diamonds, pearls all over the place. And so, very interestingly, a lot of this material was not being made in Europe necessarily. A lot of it was coming from the Philippines. So there was gold in the Philippines, but in Manila, the goldsmiths were Chinese and Filipino, and they were working to Spanish Renaissance designs. But not only that, because some of the influences, we had an expert, and a large part of that 550-page report is on the gold jewellery. Every piece is examined. And she identified influences from Java and from India and from China in the Spanish Renaissance jewellery. So, and this collection, because gold is very easily melted down, this is still one of the biggest collections of Renaissance jewellery to be found, because everyone used to melt it down and make the new fashion. So they'll just give you a few examples of what we were finding. This is a pendant. It's a lantern pendant, it's what it's called, with enamel backing. Black and white enamel. And apparently quite a few had that on, but only few pieces, this one of the only ones where the enamel survived. And very intricate filigree patterns on these chains. If you look at some of the old paintings, you'll see a big, like a sash. So the chain is worn across the shoulder of the men. It's worn around the waist of the women with a dangling, like the pendant there. And most of it was cargo. It wasn't personal belongings. It wasn't people that had fallen over the side and drowned under the weight of their own gold. It was actually loaded on board as a cargo, except for 1 or 2 pieces. So this little comb here has got the name in little gold beads there, and it's what was her name? Donna Catalina de Guzman. And it's 1617, a date there, Anno 1617. So that was a personal possession. Otherwise, we've got this fantastic gold shoe. It's about that big. It's got 24 table-cut diamonds in it and a little hole there, so it was a pendant. And this one, we don't know exactly what that was, and nobody's been able to decipher the script on it either, but it had a hinge, so there was a lid there. So maybe some sort of a talisman. This is a belt end, maybe on a leather belt. That was found in 1 metre of water up on top of the reef. So you've had all the Chamorros out there doing their spear fishing and the golfers playing golf. A few metres away, there was that lying, well within reach on top of the reef, but nobody had any idea. It was covered in a bit of rubble. And that is a part of a belt or a sash with links there. So it was part of a massive chain. And all the little wire knobs there, that was for pearls. Now, interesting, the pearl grows underwater, obviously, but it also dissolves underwater. So over hundreds of years, they dissolve. So I think we got 1 or 2 pieces with a small remnant of pearl on it. Of course, devout Catholics on board the vessel. The vessel's named the Concepcion for a reason. Lots of crosses, some in filigree, and this beautiful piece here, 1 diamond missing, but otherwise table-cut diamonds. A lovely, lovely piece. And some of the rings. So this one I showed you on the table before, now it's being cleaned up. Big sapphire, table cut, and a huge point cut diamond in those rings. We found quite a few others as well, some with multiple diamonds in them. And this is interesting. So it's pieces of plate. It's interesting for several reasons. This central section may or may not belong with the rim. The rim is extremely heavily made. This is very much a European shape, but these are lion heads or fu dogs, Chinese. Very similar to the monster head or the lion head on that blue and white jar. And here they are showing up on a plate, which we suspect. So in the archival research, the King of Spain was gifting this big plate and a ewer to the Emperor of Japan. And the governor in the Philippines, God bless him, decided he would expropriate it, and that became his personal possession. He was sending it back to his family via Acapulco. So it was either this one or something very much like it was his private cargo. That just shows the good work done by the jewellers. So this is what came up off the seabed, this crumpled mass of filigree, and after 1 or 2 months of painstaking work, they recreated the original shape, a covered box in filigree. And these are some of the chains. I had the very good fortune. We were there for 2 seasons, 4 months in the first year in 87, 6 months in 88. So we spent 10 months on this site, essentially mining that kilometre of reef. And the only reason we actually went back after the first season, after all those cannonballs and ballast stones, was this chain here, which came up looking something like that, but it's actually 32 individual chains held together with a piece of gold wire, and each one's 1.5 meters long. So this is after some of them were broken, the jewellers have put it back together, and then you've got these massive, chunky square links and these pyramid links, so that would have been worn over some thick clothing because on the skin it would have sliced you to bits. It's very sharp. And this shows Chamorro rescuing it from the shallows of the reef. So when they went back to salvage the cannons all those years later, they noticed that a lot of the Chamorros were wearing little bits of gold chain. And gold chain was hanging in the trees, it actually said. They weren't particularly interested in gold chains, but they were extremely interested in iron. So any European ship that stopped off on the way, they would trade little pieces of gold chain for the iron, which they'd use to make fish hooks and spearheads and cooking utensils and what have you. So that was much more important to them. And in fact, little chains like that, which are so long and uniform, apparently the Europeans also use it as a currency. You just break off a few links and weigh it in your Chinese weighing scales in Manila to make your purchase. So that's the beautiful gold jewellery, but we did get a few other non-jewellery artefacts. So these are sounding leads. We found 11 sounding leads, and they were actually the furthest to the east, so they must have been the bow of the ship. They were all stored in the bosun's locker right up in the bow. They all went down at the end of that scraping process along the reef. These are brass or bronze, beautifully made tacks. Those tacks go through the middle of the decoration here, and I think they were originally gilt. We found a few which still had a very thin layer of gold on the top, and they were furniture decorations. So furniture was actually another export. They made it in the Philippines with leather and these wonderful fastenings and sent back to Spain. This is an iron concretion. Unfortunately, so long ago that we did this project, I don't have the original photographs. We got an X-ray of this, and I had the great pleasure of sort of revisiting the excavation in our little warehouse in Geelong with a dental scribe to take this iron concretion apart. And it sort of demonstrates how dense the artefacts would once have been in the area we were diving. When we got to dive there, they were all spread out all over the place, and a lot have been contemporary salvage. But these big elements are iron fastenings. These are musket balls. There's a very interesting thing. It was just like a mold, but it's a ruyi, the Chinese symbol for essentially smooth sailing, was either on a piece of leather or a very thin piece of metal which is rusted away, and that was just an imprint left in the concretion. This is a mirror, two wing sides of a mirror, and there were tiny droplets we could see under a microscope of mercury so that it could reflect. There are also inside this, which we never found anywhere else on the wreck, there were glass beads. So glass beads were also a trade item, as they were on the Xiaomanche, by the way. We got tens of thousands of glass beads coming from China on that vessel, so it's a similar thing going through. We also found pepper. Pepper was inside the concretion. So that was another cargo element. And this is a pretty small display. We didn't get that many non-ceramic artifacts and non-gold artifacts on the wreck. So we did have a few Chinese coins, very few. I have no idea why they want to take Chinese coins to Acapulco, but there were some there. This is from a sword clasp to hold a sword onto a belt. These are also furniture tacks. These are sword pommels. That's a chest handle. There's a 1 real coin, silver coin. I found that in the iron concretion in Geelong. These are pieces of 8. We didn't actually find those on the wreck. So the fact that they're here means that they probably found them on the beach or in a village in Saipan. So there's a good chance they did come from the wreck, but we didn't find it. And we also had a beautifully decorated bronze cannon, which was found just behind the golf course, probably from the wreck, but we can't be sure. So these pieces actually show up in the museum. So it's the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Museum. And this is another image from that museum. So when I say that Bill was way ahead of his time, when we did this project in 1988, it was before UNESCO had even thought up the idea of having a convention on underwater cultural heritage. But their main requirement is that the collection stays together as a collection. So our project was actually a commercial project, and we sold the cargo as a collection to a Japanese company that was building a hotel in Saipan. And they vouched to keep it as a collection. They were going to put it in a museum in the lobby of their hotel. But then there was a bit of an economic collapse in Japan just after they bought it. But they were extremely generous, and instead of taking it home to Japan with them, they donated the entire collection to the government of Saipan, of the Marianas. And so we do have an intact collection, and the sale proceeds, although they looked quite admirable at the time, sort of made it a break-even project. So this was purely let's call it a purely archaeological project that conformed to all aspects over and above the UNESCO requirements, and there was no such thing at that time. So Bill is my mentor. He's a wonderful guy, and he sort of led to my working on shipwrecks from then on. And therefore, I have the pleasure of presenting this. This is the first time I've ever presented on this wreck. It's the first one I did. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for such an interesting talk. Can I please invite you to be seated for the Q&A segment? And I would also like to invite my colleague, Michael Ng, or Mikey, to join him on stage. So just a little bit about Mikey. Michael, he joined as Assistant Curator of Maritime Archaeology at ACM just recently. And he has been involved in terrestrial and underwater archaeological projects in Southeast Asia, Australia, and Jordan since 2009. And one of his key research interests include maritime archaeology, specifically ship and boat construction and trade ceramics. So I think he's the perfect person to be on stage with Michael to take on any questions that the audience might have. So please.
Okay. Hi, good evening, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen. I'm actually quite honored because I worked with Dr. Flecker on my first maritime archaeological project as well. And by the way, this is not a Halloween get-up. I'm really injured. Yeah. So without further ado, I would like to start the questions with regards to this shipwreck, but perhaps I can start with the first one. Being a budding maritime archaeologist myself, what do you think are the similarities and differences between the maritime archaeological work that we have, that you have done, like almost 30 years, like almost my age, and now?
I'm sorry, I missed the last bit. I was too busy with your age.
Oh, yeah, I just need to plus and minus a little bit, just to keep it a bit mysterious. Yeah, but what are the similarities and differences that you can see between the maritime archaeological work that has been done during that time and as compared to what we have done, like this, technologically, even techniques-wise?
Well, if I hadn't been showing this particular example, there would have been massive differences. We would have been down there with tape measures and using underwater theodolites and things like that. But the fact that Bill was so far ahead of his time using the underwater acoustic system, now it's a much smaller device, and of course the cameras are all completely self-contained, and as you were doing on our project in Singapore waters, you can do a photo mosaic of the whole site. So that sort of thing would have been unheard of at this time. So in terms of digital documentation in real time on a wreck site, it's much more advanced. But this one it's a pretty good example of how close you could get that long ago.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that enlightening kind of similarities. Actually, I feel that, to be honest, there's a lot of similarities that I see in terms of, it's just that the equipment become a little bit smaller, like compared to the big-ass camera that you see versus the GoPro that we use. It's really a big difference. I wouldn't want to carry that camera down. Yeah. So perhaps I can open the questions to the floor. Perhaps anybody have any questions regarding the shipwreck? Yes.
Sorry, I don't mean that. You said that the metal detectors didn't work on that particular site. Why was that?
I didn't provide the direct link. They didn't work because the whole seabed was covered in World War II bullets. So they actually worked too well. We spent our whole time finding bullets and shrapnel. And we also used a towed magnetometer behind a boat, which is how the anchor came quite evident very early. But that actually led to the fact that we abandoned that sort of technology and developed a sixth sense. And it's amazing how that comes in over time when you're diving every day. We actually had a bit over 10,000 individual dives over 10 months without mishap. Lucky we didn't have Mikey there. But there was, you sort of would see, because you'd found all this gold jewellery in these little cracks before, you'd see where there was likely to be a crack. And you'd move in there and you'd take a lot of time and excavate very carefully, to the point where there were some very narrow crevices, and we would go down, not just putting stuff in our glove, we'd have a little pouch, and in our pouch we'd have a set of tweezers. And you'd sometimes pull an individual link or a piece of a link out of these cracks in the bottom of the bedrock. Because the gold is so heavy, it's dense, so dense, that with all the vibrations from the waves, it always makes its way down to the very bottom. But one other instance is you had all this huge amount of sediment that we'd have to work our way through reasonably carefully, because there could still be non-gold artifacts within that sediment layer. And we had some of our Ibans. We had one Iban who was from a longhouse inland in Sarawak, never seen the sea before in his life. And he came out there diving with us, and he found in a 3-metre pile of sand and coral a diamond, which you could see straight through it. So I have no idea how he saw that, and then we matched it up with one of the rings. So that was a good outcome.
Sorry, quite early on in your slides, you had an aerial photo, a really great aerial photo of your salvage boat. At that time, I didn't think they had drones. So how did you take that aerial? And were you also trying to look down, because it was so clear what you said?
Yes, it's a good point. So we went up there when we first arrived, when the boat was coming in. A few of us got there before the boat, and we hired a light aircraft, and we took the door off so we could lean out the side and have a look. And there was a great deal of excitement about the fact that there was this big mound. So I described how the wreck was lost in 9 brasses of water at 1 musket shot from shore. So we didn't actually take a musket, but we did do some research to show how far that would be. And right in that described spot, there was a big coral mound on the bottom. So of course, there's all sorts of speculation that, wow, this is a coral-encrusted hull of the galleon. All we have to do is to chip that coral away, and we're going to find everything still stacked nicely inside. And I mean, as soon as you actually saw it diving, it was quite evident that was a real solid piece of isolated reef, nothing to do with a wreck. But there were diehards in the crew that just refused to believe that. So to satisfy them, we went on shore and we hired a pneumatic chisel. And by the way, environmentally, this whole reef was dead because of the super typhoons that had gone through. There was some nice sea life, but coral-wise, it was virtually a dead reef. So we gave them a pneumatic tool and said, off you go and find the hull underneath this coral. And about a day later, they came back with not broken eardrums, but very close, because you don't actually use pneumatic tools underwater. It's really painful. You use hydraulic tools. And they only then gave up on that wild idea there was a wreck under the coral.
Yep, I think there's a lady behind with her hands raised.
I had a question about how soon after, like, when a shipwreck happens, did they discover that it was actually a shipwreck? Like, how soon after, how many years? Because it's each shipwreck took so many years. When did they realize it was gone?
The Spanish, yeah. So it depends completely on the circumstances of the loss. So this was not a isolated reef in the middle of an ocean. It was a habitated island. And so the 30 or so that did get off, some of those managed to actually work with the natives. I think they got hold of a dugout canoe or a little with a lateen sail, and they sailed across and they got to the eastern islands of the Philippines and finally got back to Manila, but it was a year or so before they got back. And then there was going to be an expedition launched to go out there and try and recover some of the cargo, but at the same time, the Dutch were encroaching in the Spice Islands, the Portuguese were in the Spice Islands, so all the effort went into stopping the other European powers from taking any of their trade, and they gave up on any idea of going and finding the remnants of the Concepcion. So different circumstances, different times.
Any other questions, perhaps? Anything? Yeah.
If it wasn't for the chance finding of the Ming debris, imagine that it would have taken another 30 years to discover those debris. Would the impact of time changed anything on the finding under the sea, the seabed change, global warming, I don't know?
Yeah, global warming might have been a factor. It could be a few meters deeper. But otherwise, once a wreck's been on the seabed for a really long time, it's said to reach a state of near equilibrium. Not full equilibrium, but near. So things like that, the blue and white on the beach, for example, the blue and white would wear down, it would become a bit smaller, but it would still be evidently blue and white. It's already been going 350 years when we found it. So another 30 years wouldn't make a huge difference. And it's the same specific gravity as the coral and the sand. So even though our guys would go and scour the beach and strip everything off the surface, if a little bit of a storm came through, the next day it'd be all back again. A new layer had come up from the sand below. And then the jars out there in 75 meters, they're completely beyond the influence of waves. And so they're completely encrusted in coral. So they would be exactly as they were. And the gold can't be damaged, apart from getting crushed, and it was right to the bottom of the cracks and under the coral rubble, so that would have survived as well. So you do have situations like that one, the Concepcion, that was pretty well going to stay like that for a long, long time had we not found it. But the wreck that we worked on, that Mikey and I worked on here, the Temasek wreck, that was in 7 to 15 meters of water and in such rough conditions that the ceramics on that, which were all shards, they were circulating all the time. So that was far from equilibrium. So that everything was covered in coral. Something on the bottom was covered in coral, which means it had been on the surface at one time, for a long time, and recirculated. So some wrecks are different.
Yep.
Thanks, Michael, for the lecture. You mentioned that it's actually very near to the Mariana Trench, and it is still actively, as a plate tectonic, it is still deepening. So follow up to the question that she asked, does that not affect the location of the wreck? And one more question, you said there was 0 days of incident, which considering that the diving equipment that you all use is quite amazing, and hyperbaric chamber, which you brought aboard, you did not use it at all?
Oh, okay, you're pushing me a little bit there. I tend to exaggerate sometimes. I think we had one decompression sickness. It was in the hand, it was like a thumb. So we did use the chamber once to treat someone's thumb. And of course, I went to the doctor to see my broken eardrum. And that was essentially it. I think maybe someone had a piece of coral roll in their hand, we put a Band-Aid on it. So we were actually really lucky. 10,000 dives, we had 1 or 2 guys, one was bitten by a moray eel, but it was a small one. One was bitten by a triggerfish, quite a big one, so he lost a little chunk of his finger, but he was okay. But in terms of the Mariana Trench, that's actually, it looks quite close on that shot that I showed, but it's fair way to the east, and you've got Tinian Island between Saipan and the trench. So that was nowhere near the wreck site. So we did have a deep channel between Saipan and Tinian, but I think the deepest was about 400 or 500 meters.
Yeah, I see that there's a gentleman there.
Good evening. I have 2 questions. The first question is that when we always talk about galleon trade, we mainly focus on Manila and Mexico. So what are the functions of the Northern Mariana Islands? And are there any difference in function like Saipan and the other Mariana Islands? That's the first question in the Manila galleon trade. The second question would be, we always who would have brought the items from South Asia towards the Philippines? Because according to your artist inspection, that probably Indian ships or Arabian dhow would have traveled to Manila, but we always have these assumptions that Indian ships and South Asian ships and Arabian ships would stop around Manila Peninsula or Sumatra, and they return back and they won't go northwards. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, the first one, Saipan wasn't really relevant to the voyage at all. They crossed over with the southeast trade wind. They didn't need to stop. They had plenty of water and food. So the only time there was any thought of occupying Saipan was purely to spread the religion, for Catholics, the priests to come in and spread the religion. And coming back, they weren't even supposed to be there. They were supposed to have turned north and gone up towards Japan. So it was just there, and it happened to be in the way of the Concepcion on the way back. The other question regarding the Arab and Indian dhows, yes, you're quite relevant much earlier on. So around the time of the Belitung wreck, yes, there was a period where the dhow would go all the way from the Middle East up to China, as is proven by the Belitung wreck with the Chinese cargo on board. Other times it would stop off on the west side of the Isthmus of Kra, then they'd transship across, just like this one did from Acapulco to Santa Cruz, and then the load onto another ship that would go into China. So at different periods they did that. But when you're getting to the 17th century, that's well within their capability to go all the way. So it could be the Indian vessels, it could be Arab vessels, it could be Chinese vessels going there, it could be European vessels. So you had the Portuguese, plenty of them there, and they all did intermediate trade. Any opportunity they were trading. And some would go to Manila, some would go to Macau, the Portuguese. So it's actually all over the place. So there's no limitation on where any type of vessel would go by the 17th century.
You mentioned that there were some 40 vessels that were lost over time. Was there an area that represented greater loss in that route around from Acapulco to Manila and then back to Acapulco?
Just that last sentence was an area that...
Was there a cluster? Was there ever a cluster of wrecks because of particular terrain or wind or season?
No, in fact, the majority were lost without trace. So that huge voyage back, not so many lost on the way to the Philippines, but quite a lot were lost on the way back. I think one was even found drifting either without any crew on board or with skeletons on board or something off the coast of California. But in terms of wrecks, most of them occur within the Philippines, on the reefs of the Philippines. San Bernardino Strait was very treacherous. So they'd have to go against counter winds, massive currents. They'd always anchor up and wait for the current to change and try and race through before it changed direction again. So there's several in that location. And since we did the Concepcion, there's the San Diego has been found just to the southwest of Manila with quite a intact cargo, although I think it was actually in a battle when it went down. And a couple of others have been found that have been undergoing contemporary salvage. There was one other found in Guam, I think the Pilar, where that was a silver cargo on the way to Manila, and not much of that was found.
Yeah, as we are moving our conversations toward the topic of the galleon trade, and before we proceed with the last question, we'd like to take this opportunity to extend our deepest condolences to the people of Acapulco. We are saddened by the tragic loss of lives and injuries arising from Hurricane Otis, which struck Acapulco on the 28th October 2023. Our thoughts and prayers are with those who lost their loved ones during this difficult time, and we wish those injured a speedy recovery. Yeah, so maybe we can field one more last question, something about anything that's related to the shipwreck, construction, archaeological process, and stuff. So I would go for the gentleman behind. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the very interesting lecture that you gave. How about the galleon itself? Did you try to salvage any parts of the boat, the ship, like maybe the sails, maybe what textile, and then the kind of wood that was used for the Concepcion? Any data on this?
No, so there was nothing left of the ship. So she had gone along the edge of the reef, she'd completely broken up. There are reports of pieces of ship structure washing up on the islands in the east of the Philippines months after the wreck event. So it was completely shattered, and those pieces that may have remained on the seabed may be pinned down by some of the heavy cargo or the ballast stones were eaten by teredo worms. So there wasn't enough sediment cover to bury it and protect it from worm. So unfortunately, I think we did get some fittings. We got some of the bolts. We got one huge, like a 2.5 meter long keel bolt that shows potentially the dimensions of the vessel, but no wood remains at all.
Okay, I think that is it. Thank you very much for being a nice audience, a good audience. Thank you, Dr. Flecker as well, and Minister.
Thank you, Dr. Michael Flecker, for bringing us on this journey of adventure and exploration. We have come to the end of the talk today, and I would like to thank Royal Insignia once again for the very generous sponsorship for making this talk happen. And of course, this is not the end, because we are going to have the opening of the Manila Galleon exhibition, our special exhibition on the 16th of November. So we hope to see all of you all back when the exhibition opens at ACM. And yes, and Hinrich Foundation, who is amongst the audience today, is a key supporter of this exhibition, and we'd really like to thank the foundation for the kind support. And we have the ambassador from the Embassy of Mexico here as well, with his lovely wife. So we'd like to thank him for coming today. At this point, I would also like to promote the next talk coming up. Of course, it's a bit of a switch in the topic on our SG Fashion Now. So that's what makes ACM Conversations so interesting. We have a variety of different topics. So we hope to see you back. And just a little bit about this talk on the 30th of November. We will have 3 young designers who will be sharing more on their brand journey over the years. And they have exhibited their works in the SG Fashion Now in Korea. And it's going to be quite exciting to hear from them. And also, one more thing before we leave, we would really appreciate if you could give us your feedback so we could continue to improve the next session coming up, and hope to see all of you all back again. Hope you have a great evening. Thank you for coming.